Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience here. Welcome to the second session of United by Sustainability, which is a webinar series presented by the SCA. I'm your host, Ellie Hudson, coming at you live from my guest bedroom so that I don't wake my sleeping child because it's 6 o'clock in the morning here. But as we mentioned on Tuesday, we wanted to offer this series at a regular times, but different times on different days of the week. And that was primarily to try and accommodate our global audience. And so we've never offered, to my knowledge, anything quite like this at these various times. And so thank you for being part of this first offering. Can everyone see my screen okay? Does everything look the way it's supposed to look? All right, so if you attended on Tuesday, this is a little bit of a repeat, but I think we have a lot of new participants due to the different time. So obviously this is a time of incredible uncertainty and loss for many of our coffee businesses in our community. And as the SCA, we sort of looked at, what does our community want? And we really tried to ask and talk to people. And so this is where we came up with this idea for a learning opportunity. And so the emphasis is about topics within sustainability that maybe we haven't covered before or haven't covered in a specific way, and giving our community a chance to come together around something, and specifically a learning opportunity. So as I mentioned, we do have these regular scheduled sessions now that the two offices are aligned on their daylight savings. Everything's in Pacific Daylight Time and British Summer Time here. But just as I mentioned, the Thursday sessions we will be offered twice. They're both live, but sometimes slightly different panelists. So actually that's the case this afternoon as well. We'll have some of the same panelists, some different. As you can see below, we start with a short update on any sort of COVID-19 emerging resources. And we don't have anything new for this session as compared to Tuesday, but I do want to take the opportunity to direct people to the sca.coffee website, where you will find the COVID-19 at the regular menu bar, and you can really take a look at the community-driven resources. This is updated. Anyone in the coffee community can submit their resources, so you can sort by retail or coffee technician or region, type of resource, news, inspirational pieces, things specific to mental health. It's really an incredible database that our comms team has put together for our community. So I encourage everyone to visit that. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. So this morning, we will be hearing in just a moment from Stephanie Daniels, who you see in the middle. And like my photo at the beginning, I had asked our presenters if they could provide a frat back photo. So mine at the beginning was circa 2008. Those of you that have been friends and colleagues in that time will recognize that era, as long as some special guests in the background. And Stephanie's in the middle, and then Christina Archer, her colleague, will be following that. And then we're going to shift to talk about living wage, and that will be Michelle Bhattacharyya. Jeremy is one of the afternoon presenters, so that's why you don't see him here today. And you also see Jessica, who is our representative from the Barista Guild. Okay, so we had our note on emerging resources, introduction and context, which will be provided by Stephanie in just a moment. We will then focus a little bit on living income for farmers, and then finally living wage for baristas and retail workers. These are all, both of these topics, core topics, could easily have their own webinar, and very well may in the future. We definitely want to hear from you. Our Sierra Hatcher from our comms team will be curating your questions as you type them into the chat, and when time allows, we'll try to read as many questions as we can, and in some cases we can even unmute and talk live among one another. And then just like on Tuesday, we'll be supporting this discussion with the participation of polls. And so some of these are unscientific polls. This is a small audience that we just kind of want to hear what people are feeling and what your sentiments are. The polls are confidential. If you do submit a question, our custom is to use your first name and say, Maria asked such and such, Pedro asked such and such. If you wish to remain anonymous in your submission of questions, please just state in that question, and then we just won't read your name. The poll submissions, it just shows the whole audience, so it doesn't show who answered which way, and that information is confidential. So we don't explicitly go through these specific questions, but I think just to kind of set the tone and get everybody transitioning from introduction housekeeping mode to the topic at hand, these are the questions that we wrestled with in order to produce this webinar. So really from an idea of like, what is the difference between living income and living wage? What is the movement? Why is it important? And really, where does specialty coffee fit in? And certainly me and my own company. And then finally, we really did try to consider the current pandemic as one must. We know that it has drastically affected coffee businesses and the decision making. And I think that it's fair to say that many coffee professionals are wrestling with how to prioritize some of these long-term ambitions and long-term visions with being in survival mode, and sort of what does that mean? All right. I did mention this already, just to reinforce the chat. You can type questions. We can give you the chance to speak by unmuting you. We will use your first name unless you tell us not to. And then just as a note, again, the polls are confidential. They're not anonymous. It actually does generate a report on the back end that we could download, but we never do. But it is kept confidential. It doesn't show it in the webinar. Okay. So this is the part where I am going to transition over to Stephanie. Just give me a moment.
Ellie, are you going to ask the poll first, or that comes after?
I couldn't decide. Let's do one now. Actually, no. Let's do it after.
Okay.
All right. All right, Stephanie, you should have the opportunity to share your screen.
Okay, can you see living income, living wage?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As Ellie said, I'm Stephanie Daniels. I work with a nonprofit called the Sustainable Food Lab. We're a global network focused on scaling sustainability and mainstream food and agriculture. We're also one of the co-founders and co-hosts of the Living Income Community of Practice. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the community of practice, but I just want to say it is a open, free virtual learning platform for anyone to join, discuss, and co-create resources around this concept of living income, which I'll talk a little bit about. We have two objectives: one, to increase the understanding of living income measurement, so methods, benchmarks, etc. And the second, to provide a space to identify and discuss strategies for improving farmer income, and overall to share learning and collaborate between actors. And there's a website, living-income.com, and Ellie has shared some resources in the handouts as well. So I just want to start with the concept, because this is actually not something new. It's something that many in the coffee sector has been working on for many years. It's perhaps a new word, living income. And if we just think about stepping back from any sort of academic definition, the concept is really that if you're putting 100% of your time into something, whether it be working at a cafe, driving a truck, working at a wet mill, growing coffee, ideally you should be working in a condition that you could make a decent standard of living. So this is a concept that is we're using applied to small farmers particularly, but it's about households affording a decent standard of living. And what does that mean? To afford a decent standard of living is defined as the net annual income. So your income, which comes from a variety of sources. For coffee farmers, it can be coffee and other income, is sufficient to cover the cost of a decent standard of living for a typical household in that place, wherever you live. And this Ellie, sorry, just because the control panel is in my view shed. Do you see that or no?
The living income concept?
No, just the dialog box of GoToWebinar. I just want to make sure it's not in the.
Oh, no, we don't see
Okay,
it.
great.
I know what you mean.
So yeah, sorry. So decency, I just want to stress that word. That's kind of the core of the concept of both living income, living wage. And its elements are food, water, housing, education, healthcare, and other essential needs, including a provision for unexpected events. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's defined. Okay, so the concept of this basic but decent standard of living underpins both the concepts, living wage and living income. I'm not going to speak about living wage. Michelle later will speak about that, but that really is the concept of a worker earning enough in a standard work week to enable his or her family to afford a decent standard of living. And I'll just point people to the Global Living Wage Coalition for some common resources there. I'll be speaking to living income, which is about farming households earning enough in a year from all their income sources to afford a decent standard of living. So this is the whole story. In the community of practice, we've tried to create sort of open source graphics to help us as a community, global community, to envision this concept in the same way. So I'll talk through each part of these graphics separately. First is having a standard and shared way to decide on this cost of a basic decent standard of living for a household. So in the community of practice, we refer to a method developed by two global experts, Richard and Martha Anker, and that's a public methodology that can be shared, but it essentially uses international standards, national standards for decency, and goes to a place to understand how much does a decent diet cost, how much does a decent housing cost. So not luxury, that kind of thing, but a basic, if you're going to have a nutritious diet and you had to go to the market to buy that, how much would it cost? Other essential needs and unexpected events. So that's the benchmark. And then you compare the benchmark of how much it costs for a decent standard of living with how much does a family make, and that's the actual income. And in this case, we're talking about farmers, so we're typically thinking about the income from the farm, but of course there are also off-farm income. Many coffee farmers will go and work as coffee workers, or the spouse will have a trading business or some other, or be a teacher or nurse. I mean, that's the same for farmers in most countries, whether it's France or Canada or Guatemala. So as you look at the net income from the farm, we're looking at the income from coffee, the primary cash crop. You might have a secondary crop, bananas or maize. What's the income from that? And then, of course, many farmers grow their own food or part of their own food. And that, even if it's not sold as an income source, it does come into the picture because it brings down the cost of food that you would have to buy outside. So just on the right, you can see we compare revenues, obviously, with the costs. And those include both input, land, labor, and longer term costs. And in the living income work that many people do, what we're looking to focus on is where is there vulnerability in our supply chain. So if you're a specialty coffee buyer and you have 12 origins, say, is there a place where you know that poverty is high and there's high dependence on coffee? Do you know about how much that gap is? And this can get very detailed and measured, or it can be kind of a sense check where you say, okay, we think it's very expensive to live in this place. Coffee farmers aren't able to make that much. Then we need to really pay attention to our trading practices or maybe our investments in that region. So this income gap is the difference between actual income and the living income benchmark. In some places, we know that the actual income is above the benchmark. It's above the poverty line and above the living income benchmark, and that's what we hope for all farmers. For some, it's quite hard for different reasons, maybe farm size and that kind of thing. So I'm going to stop there. And Ellie, that's the basics of the concept. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Christina Archer, who will talk about how this concept is being used in coffee. But I would encourage, when we get to the Q&A, let's go back and make sure that we have the concepts clear.
Thanks, Stephanie. So my name is Christina Archer and I work with Stephanie at the Sustainable Food Lab. The last couple of years I've been focusing quite a bit on the coffee sector and how it relates to the living income work that's been going on. So I've been following some of the developments there. As Stephanie says, living income has been a focus for many other commodity sectors for quite some time, cocoa, tea, for example. And coffee obviously had many other programs looking at economic viability of farmers, the challenges posed by climate change and so on. But a couple of years ago, sort of when the price crisis hit, there was a renewed interest in trying to see whether the living income concept actually could be a useful framing for the coffee sector as well, to see if all of these investments we've been doing, are they adding up to being good enough? What do the farmers that we're working with actually need? So there's been some really huge leaps and bounds, if you like, in the coffee sector in terms of getting involved in lots of different initiatives. Some of the main ones are listed on the screen. There's been some country-specific work going on. For example, a study that was done by ICEAL and COSA in Kenya in the coffee growing communities there. So trying to see if investments in coffee regions has helped farmers there meet or work towards the benchmarks that were identified in those countries. We have organizations such as Shift working in Uganda with GIZ in trying to do some benchmarking there in coffee areas. Fair trade is really deeply involved in this in quite a number of regions and are developing reference prices over the course of this year, I believe. But two of the sort of the bigger pieces of work, if you like, one which I'm sure many of you are familiar with was the signing in September of the London Declaration by the ICO, which within the economic viability sort of umbrella has identified living income and called it out specifically as a way of helping to achieve economic sustainability of farmers. ICO is still in the process of setting up a task force on the various strands of work which are covered by the London Declaration, but one of them is living income, and there is planned to be a living income working group within that. What that will look like and composition is still to be determined, but I think an interesting development because, as you know, ICO involves both the private sector and governments as well. So the fact that it's the concept of living income is taking prominence in that sort of forum, I think is indicative of how the terminology is now becoming more accepted and more commonplace. One of the major piece of work, though, that I think, well, I'm hoping a lot of you will have seen, is a piece of work done by IDH recently with participation of many with many people from the coffee sector, including STA and many different brands and so on. It's a big piece of work to look at living income in the coffee sector, but using Colombia as a case study. So drawing on a lot of data that companies and their partners were able to provide what does living income look like in Colombia in 2018-19? What would a benchmark, what is a benchmark for Colombia for specific regions, and what are we seeing about the types of farmers that we have in Colombia and whether they are or aren't meeting the benchmark that was identified. The work was organized around a task force. So IDH pulled together a task force that had as I said, very wide representation, not only from the private sector, but also other organizations as well. And over the course of quite a few months, they were able to process, as I said, a lot of information that was coming through. And compared to some of the other work that's been done, they have started to identify certain archetypes of farmers. So as we know, all coffee farmers aren't the same. And most of the listeners on this webinar, of course, belong to the specialties segment. And that was very much identified as a core, one of the main archetypes. About 10% they felt of the coffee would fit into that. Obviously, the vast majority of coffee farmers are selling into a market that is maybe lower grade, not certified, not having recognition for quality and so on. But there was recognition that we have the archetype that's selling into the higher end, higher value specialty market. So the report is available on the IDH website. I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you haven't already. I think it's really interesting because using the example of Colombia, you're able to sort of see, okay, in this particular origin, in this context, what is the benchmark? How is that calculated? What does decency mean or look like? What is the cost of a decent standard of living for specific areas in the southern parts of Colombia? And how are the different archetypes, are they meeting it or not? In majority of cases, it won't surprise you to know that they aren't meeting it, especially in the lower value archetypes. But then it is able to sort of give some recommendations which were validated in the various meetings that we had as to how then the sector and specifically actors within each archetype, how can we work together to try and close those gaps. And there was great hope, especially for the specialty segment, where some farmers were found to already, even with the current pricing, were already meeting at least the World Bank poverty line, but in many cases actually meeting the living income poverty line as well. The majority, of course, are not, but there are very clear indications about how, with improvements either in productivity or quality and other interventions, that gap, there is possibility that that gap can definitely be made smaller. Of course, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of caveats as to which the different typologies of farmers, even within specialty. You have some that are smaller and more productive, and some that are bigger, and so on. So all of that is taken into account and is discussed in the report. It does, as I say, it does come out with a lot of really interesting recommendations for the sector. So some, kind of quite top level policy ones in terms of how do we, with our partners in country, with the coffee institutes, with the local governments, who's responsible for some of that bigger data set gathering. There's some very clear recommendations again about providing supports to farmers and who can help with that. And then by archetype as well, they have more specific recommendations as well. And for the specialty sector, there's very much links around pricing and premiums and how they can be looked at in a bit more detail with the framework of a living income benchmark. Now, I do appreciate that post COVID, that context is going to change somewhat, and already I'm sure most of you as well, we're hearing of quite worrying developments in origins where farmers aren't able to harvest, they're not able to get the beans aren't being exported and so on and so forth. So what that economic reality for many of the farmers looks like in 2020, 2021 is going to change. So I would hope there would be a review of some of those findings in light of that. as I said, I'm sure there will be. Other recommendations that came out were also trying to get actors in the supply chains to think about what do we, if we're going to use living income as a framework, what else do we need to know? And there was a wealth of rich data about coffee incomes, coffee costs. There's ongoing work going on by many different organizations to look at the costs and the productivity around coffee. But what we didn't seem to know much about was the other income sources that, as you will have seen in Stephanie's presentation, is a key part of the puzzle. And in some cases, actually will be really important for farmers that we know can't make a living income from only coffee because of the size of their farm, availability of labor and so on. Then other sources of income suddenly become, or suddenly, other sources of income will be quite important. And there's a lack of information there. So one of the calls was, how do we, again, not necessarily through individual supply chains, but maybe with other actors, how do we get a better understanding of these other sources of income? Who does that? That was just a particular call out I wanted to mention. Ongoing, as you can see on the slide, and I mentioned earlier, we have many different initiatives happening. We haven't yet found a central point for coordinating some of this interest, but we're having lots of discussions and trying to piece people together who are interested in benchmarks in specific countries. And I think I'll leave it there. Rattle through.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, and on that note, we do have a couple of polls to just ask a little bit about. First, this is just to the best of your knowledge, and obviously I don't know is one of the options if you don't know. So we're interested in hearing if you, either as a buyer of coffee or as a coffee farmer yourself, do you earn a living income, or do the farmers you work with earn a living income? Right, good. We've got some responses coming in. We've got about 30%. Still more answers coming in. About 66% have voted, 71%. Probably keep it open for another 10 seconds or so. All right, we're up to almost 80%, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. All right, so here are the results. As we know that for many of you, this does not apply, and you can see that in the results here, but I'm happy to see that there are some respondents that have already pursued this and are working toward this or are experiencing this firsthand. And then Christina alluded to this, so we would like to hear how your importance, the pursuit of living income, how important is it to your company, and has that changed during this global health pandemic? %. Give it a little bit more time.
Ellie, you need poll music.
I know. I've never figured out how to do that. I probably just need to like play it from my phone, lo-fi. All right, we're up over 70% of you have voted. Just give it another couple of seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. And you can see the results here. So 0% that it has gone down in importance. Happy to see that obviously it has raised this as an issue for some companies, but it seems like many, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, these are not scientific polls in any stretch. And of course, attendees of a living income webinar are probably more likely to respond that it's important. But I think it's helpful for us to see, and I hope that it's insightful for you to kind of know a little bit where you stand in the industry. And maybe for some of us, it helps us to feel a little less alone. All right, I'm going to take back the presentation. Give me a moment. Okay. Okay. Before I hand this over to, see, go back here. Before I hand this over to Michelle, I wanted to just take a minute to address some of the questions that have been coming in, or see if we have any hands raised. This is a good time if you have questions or comments to share. All right. Looks like we don't have any questions, so we're going to go ahead and carry on. I'm going to, at this point, welcome Michelle, and I'll keep the presentation, but introduce or welcome Michelle to begin speaking.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie. So I'm glad everyone was able to join today. For me, early in the morning here in New York, but I'm just scattered across all of those times everywhere. And what I really wanted to talk about today was baristas, and also how a living wage for baristas and how a living wage for other workers actually contributes to part of an overall culture that extends then to the supply chain, or should extend to the supply chain, and how to think about a living wage and a living income as one concept. And then really to say, let's not take it out of the bubble of time that we're in right now. How does it directly relate to what we're dealing with COVID-19? And why is it that this is an incredible, it's a very, very difficult time in terms of business, but it's also an incredible opportunity to reframe how this industry and how businesses are working, so that we don't run into some of the same issues in the future. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. What you're seeing is I'll go through in just a second. It's using Portland because Rico was going to be in Portland, and I was looking a little bit about what living wages are for a barista in Portland, and I'll take you through that. But what I really want you to be able to come out with here is, if you're a retailer or you're a cafe or you're a roaster, is what could you do in this opportunity where many of us have, the one thing we do have is time, a lot of time. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time at home right now. I don't really go anywhere, and there's a huge opportunity to say, well, how can I really think through the things that will help make my business better when we try to recover from this? We are in an environment right now where the entire world is understanding that when business comes back to the way it supposedly used to be, there will be changes, right? That everything isn't going to come back exactly the same way. Now what that offers is an opportunity for you to think about, how do I rebuild things? Because I'm sure all of you, especially those that have had to close their doors, that are trying to figure out how you're going to take care of the baristas you have now, what kind of situations that they're in, how you're going to take care of your ongoing work and make sure you stay open when this whole crisis ends, are looking at, how do I rebuild that business? And that presents an opportunity to say, can I rebuild this business where some of the struggles that we hit in this, where when I was really thinking about what are my baristas going to do, what's going to happen to my supply chain when farmers aren't going to be able to earn enough to harvest, they're not going to be able to harvest, aren't going to be able to earn enough. Will they be there next year? What's going to happen to these huge pieces that that means you actually have a sustainable industry to rebuild back in. And the opportunity is to say, well, what would focusing on a living wage and a living income for supply chains, as Stephanie and Christina so well spoke about, what would that do for positioning me as a company coming back from this to contribute to a more sustainable industry and not have the same issues? And baristas to me are really a key point, because baristas are the people who are communicating to your customers, to the end consumer, right? They're sort of on the front lines in a lot of ways. And what you have here is an environment where consumers have a heightened awareness of what happens when an unexpected event hits society and people can't earn. And you have a mass body of consumers that suddenly understand, oh, this is a really bad situation, and we might be finding ourselves in that situation. You know, we understand others who are finding themselves in the situation, and the idea of making sure that everyone can achieve a decent living and have some money put aside to keep living during some unexpected crisis that may occur is much more top of mind for consumers. And so that offers an opportunity for a conversation. Baristas are the ones that are going to have that conversation. So to me, they're the front line of how do you pay a barista a living wage, so that when they're talking to consumers about the importance of this and the importance of how it would affect their life in a new unexpected crisis, they're doing so from a point of understanding personally and appreciating personally with passion what it affords them. Now, Stephanie mentioned earlier the anchor methodology to estimating a living wage. There are other methodologies to estimating living wage. I'm a big supporter of the anchor methodology, and I have been for a really long time as well. But what I want to talk about, that often applies to supply chain countries. I mean, it can apply to others, but that's where estimates have been done by the Global Living Wage Coalition. That's where the Living Income Community of Practice has, done estimates for supply chains. What I'm really looking at is in Europe, in the US, and in lots of countries where you're having your baristas that should include the entire globe, how are we looking at living wages there, so that you can leave this and go home and say, oh, I can start seeing what the gap is between what I pay my baristas and what would be a living wage. And I think that's important, because the concept of a living wage that Stephanie explained, that I think you should carry over into anything you're looking at for your baristas, includes a margin for unexpected events. That margin is for savings. That is a really essential margin. It is the one piece that goes above and beyond paying for your basics every month. And the anchor methodology, it's usually around 5%. So for the sake of working through numbers for an example important, I put in 5%. There can be more conversation about this. I like to say in advance, these numbers are put together quickly. They're not meant to be an exact science. I'm trying to guide you on what you can do when you're thinking about this and why. But the key is really that imagine what you would be dealing with today if you knew, and if you could have the conversation with your baristas, with others that you're employing, to say, we want to make sure that we're paying you enough that every month you can put something aside, so that if anything ever happens and you're having to get through this kind of tragedy, which it's not a hypothetical if anything ever happens anymore, it's a reality if anything ever happens anymore that could cost you income, then you're going to have something to supplement what you need to make sure you can continue to get by. And we're going to know our baristas are still there with us. We're going to know that others that work for us are still there with us, and we can work together to get past these kinds of situations. And the way that you'd go home and look at that is, I put up some figures for Portland. But you can look at this pretty much anywhere across the US. You can look at this if you're looking in the UK Living Wage Foundation has estimates of what a living wage is there. In the US, I've been using the basis of the MIT Living Wage Calculator in order to understand what a living wage is in the US. And I'm sure if you contact Ellie and say, I really want to know what a living wage is in this country that I'm working in, and I really want to understand what it is for my baristas in this other location, let her know, give that feedback, because I'm sort of happy to try and look into what resources are best to use at this time and closest to sort of think about in terms of this anchor methodology that includes money for unexpected events. And what you're looking at here is what the minimum wage is in Portland in that little black bar. And then the bar all the way to the right would be the living wage in the framework of the living income concept Stephanie just talked about, which means the wage needed to contribute to a family covering their cost of living and having a living income in Portland. And this is assuming that there's 2 working adults in the family with 2 children, right? So if we're making that assumption, the bar all the way to the right is how much you would need to earn to make sure your family has a living income. Now, the barista typical wage, I'm going to tell you really quickly where I pulled that from. It is not an academic study. It is basically a barista that started collecting wages online of baristas all over the country in the US. Through sort of voluntary surveys, and started posting the Excel spreadsheets about what they see in every different place. And there's a large number of baristas that were contributing to that were self-reported. I pulled those figures to give a general estimate, but it just sort of gives you a sense. You should look at what you're paying your own people, but it gives you a sense of what they might be earning against a living wage. Now, if you just looked at the MIT living wage calculator, which is a wonderful, wonderful tool, and you said, oh, an individual living wage is X, and I, with tips, my baristas, the typical wage are earning more than that. So they're earning a living wage. We don't have to think about that. When a crisis like this hits, you're fooling yourself into thinking paying an individual a living wage is actually something that's going to be able to help them. And that's why I like this as framed in a living income concept, because if that individual has a child, you're suddenly not able to afford what you need to live. And that whole margin maybe for unexpected events disappears. So it's really an idea of looking at how do I pay a living wage that contributes to a household living income in the way that Stephanie talked about that before, but for my baristas, for the people who are my direct employees. The other thing that I would like to say is if you want to do this for yourself and you have locations across the country, you can go on to MIT's living wage calculator today and you can look at what the estimate is for 2 working adults, 2 children, which would be a family sort of size in the US that we would deal with. I can explain that in more detail later. And you can say, I need to add certain layers on this that are not included in that calculator. First layer, healthcare. If you don't provide healthcare that's paid for, that you pay for, then it's not included in that estimate that's on MIT. That assumes that healthcare is provided by the employer. So if you don't, which case in many situations, especially smaller businesses, go on to that local, in this case, the way I came up with that healthcare estimate that is above and beyond is if someone had to buy insurance for themselves. That's that sort of dark gray bar that would be there. If they have to buy insurance for themselves, they need to earn this extra amount. The way I find that is simply going on to the insurance exchanges, putting in what the estimated living wage is for the MIT calculator, and finding out how much subsidy you get at that point and how much the plan would cost for a silver level plan, which is the necessary one for a government subsidy. So this is something, the reason I'm sort of spelling this out for you is because I want you to be able to walk away from this and go take a look during this time that we have where we might not be operating at where your baristas have fallen against a living wage. What are you paying? What should you be paying if you wanted to cover this? And then add on that the 5% for unexpected events, because that's not included either in the MIT calculations. That is a part of the anchor methodology. And I think in this crisis, I couldn't stress any more how important that is, because that's really the piece that gives people a little bit of security when something rather unexpected hits, and really the piece that we need to frame in our minds when we're trying to work through how to respond to COVID-19. So that's, like I said, in the UK Living Wage Foundation has these estimates. There's different ways you can look at them, but these are the pieces that I sort of want to take you through, because that gap allows you to plan for, okay, I need to pay baristas this much more. if I really want to take care of them in future situations like this. And I need to make sure that those tips are actually regular and expected, you know, that I'm not just landing them out there without much. And I need to cover that if a crisis happens and, you know, they can't handle tips. That's what I want to really plan on covering. And I want to use my baristas to then, when they're put into a more secure situation, talk to my consumers about why maybe that impacts price, you know, why maybe that impacts the way we're doing things. Because I'll tell you what, right now, a lot of what I've heard in the past, I've been working on this issue for a really long time, and I always hear, well, people are really uncomfortable with change. You know, if we put our price up just a little bit, people are going to react in a really major way. Well, let me tell you something. Nobody knows what to expect. Not one consumer, not me, not anyone, when we come out of this in terms of how it's going to impact the prices that we typically pay and why we do so. And all of us, or a large majority of us, are really prepared to support people and our communities in making sure they can earn enough to get through these kinds of things. And it's really top of mind. So that's just this huge opportunity to rework the way you're thinking and to start talking with your consumers if you're opening back up in the future. I'm coming from a New York standpoint where everything's been shut for a while, so I'm just making that assumption it is for you. But, you know, you can start that conversation. Now, I want to take it to one more level, and I know I talk a lot, and then I'll try and make this one really brief because this is really what Stephanie and Christina talked through, which is, how do you think about this that I'm talking about for baristas, and not just baristas, for anyone that works for you, right? That the idea of a living wage for all of those, and how do you extend that to say this should be part of your culture of your company and extend to your supply chain, and we shouldn't necessarily separate these two. My past was working in the supply chain. So I switched to the well, still do both, but I started working in the US a couple of years ago. And one of those reasons was because there seemed to be this huge disconnect where people were either having human resources people that really understood living wage and living income for their own employees, but had horribly rough supply chains, or some great, you know, social responsibility staff that really were working hard on a living income or a living wage for the supply chain, but completely wasn't translating to their own employees. And I was working with a farmer once that said to me, yeah, I get it. I get, you know, why I need to pay a living wage to my employees, but are the people selling my product, are they earning a living wage in your backyard? And are the companies that are pressuring me to say I need to pay more to people who work with me, are they paying their own workers a living wage? And in most cases, the answer was no. You know, and that's a really rough thing to present. And so I'm going to argue that you can think of this in terms of culture, and I'm going to argue for ways that you, let's say if you're a retailer that is in coffee, can look in a very basic way about your responsibility. And this doesn't take away at all to some of the global bigger initiatives that Stephanie and Christina talked about. I think those are sort of essential and really get at the key of it. But what I'm trying to deliver are quick ways that you can think about or get estimates of what would you need to do in rebuilding your business model after this COVID-19 crisis to think about living wage and living income all the way through your supply chain. And so this is saying, well, let's talk to your farmers that you probably, since you're specialty coffee, have a relationship with, and ask them a few questions. You know, I think the first that usually they know, like what % of your cost production is labor? So let's say that's typically upwards of around 70%. In a lot of places, you know, you can have that relationship for whatever the figure comes out to. And then just simply ask, well, what are you currently paying workers, or what do you think you're earning an hourly rate for the coffee that you're producing? How much are you really making to live off of if you were to look at it that way? Or how much are you paying if you do have workers? How much are you paying them? And in sort of an hourly way, how does that work out? And I know a lot of things are piece rate, but you can think about how much that might break down to and what you're selling. And then you're going to look at some resources, and I appreciate Stephanie mentioning the Global Living Wage Coalition, the Living Income Community of Practice, and see where there are sort of, I would originally suggest first anchor methodology estimates of what a living wage or living income is. If you're looking at a living wage estimate, you can look at the cost of living estimate as the sort of living income estimate in order to work in this sort of rough way, and say, well, if we had this living wage estimate for this specific location that we got from the Global Living Wage Coalition, and I understand how much people are really earning for the coffee that they're selling me at the price I'm paying, what's that percent difference? Maybe you're 20%, you need a 20% increase in what's paid, right, in order to achieve a living income or a living wage for that farmer. Now, I'm not trying to pretend that what I'm talking through is going to be a living income for all farmers. I'm talking about how, if you're a retailer, to cover your responsibility and thinking about this in this time with the data we have now, you know, at the best of your ability to get an estimate on how to rebuild. And that's basically saying, we want to take that gap and apply it to a 20% increase to what our current price is, what we pay. We know that they're earning 20% too little. So let's increase the price on that 70% that covers labor, 70% of what we're currently paying, by 20% and see what that would do. Now, I'm not saying you can all go out and pay that, but you should have an assessment in your head of that's what would cover with the current production conditions and the current profit margins and everything else for your producer. That's what it would need to cover these basics. So that's how I would address that, and just giving you a couple more resources and then I'll stop. This is just talking about that equation that I just went through. So hopefully we can share these with you as well, but if you're applying that percentage to that 70%, you will get, and this is, again, I'm not trying to give you something academic and scientific. The work the Living Income Community Practice is doing is far more advanced, and the way that they're looking at this is much more complicated. I'm just giving you a simple way to think about how you're going to plan your business after this crisis, and what kind of gaps you should be thinking about, and how that might affect your bottom line. So that's it from me now. And baristas can communicate that. That's why it starts there in my mind.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. This is incredible. I'm going to launch another quick poll and then turn it over to Jessica, who will be commenting on behalf of the Barista Guild, or perhaps asking questions. You know, Jessica agreed to be here knowing this is such an integral issue for baristas representing the BG. So let's just kind of see a little bit about your sentiment on pursuit of a living wage for baristas and retail workers, and whether it's something that you as a company do already, or has it changed? Or actually, this doesn't ask if you do it, it asks if it's important. Sorry. Right, a little bit up to about 50% have voted. And so I'll give it about another 10 seconds. Okay. So you can see the results. I think this is something that does recognize what Michelle was kind of alluding to, which is that this is an important issue for specialty coffee. So it sounds like that is in agreement with our audience as well. Okay, Jessica, did you want to make a comment or maybe perhaps ask a question?
Yes, thank you for letting me be part. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it takes to me a lot of feelings, this topic, because I'm from Colombia, actually. I live in Slovenia, so I can understand what you speak about producer countries, Christina and Stephanie. And for one comment, or just to bring it here, is sometimes we living in a first world country don't realize how is life or what is important or are the basics for the people in the producing country. So I want to bring an example like what it means a meal for a producing country, or for when from people in the US and in Europe. It's totally different how they feel what is basic. So they can probably in Colombia, for example, can probably people live every day eating the same meal and not balanced meal, but they are still having a meal. So how ensure the quality and the education for the farmers, so they can also have a voice, and they have power to also one day to ask for the price of a coffee, not just to say, yeah, they will have the basic, but how to help them to grow, and in this way also to give power to the farmers, so they can decide what the real cost of the coffee is. Or yeah, I know this is a really heavy topic, but yeah, I feel like they don't have so much voice, or they just receive what, even sometimes if they have certificates of fair trade, sometimes they don't receive the total price for this certification as well. So how to ensure the support? I know, yeah, this is this topic, and yeah, I would like to know what you think about this equality in this case, and how the farmers could learn more. For both Christine and then later for Michelle about barista.
Thank you, Jessica. We have a couple questions coming in. This one is from Bruna. And Jessica, maybe you even wanted to comment on this. Aren't barista jobs at risk of existing for the next year or so until lockdown is completely open? And how can we deal with that to help?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also know, because I work at barista for 10 years, and yeah, this situation is really like, in this moment, the barista is not considered in the play, in like in the surviving, how the companies are surviving. So we expect from government that will maybe pay some companies, but I mean, as Michelle spoke about the structure of companies, when companies have the savings, and they have this in consideration, that it's possible that comes some unexpected situations, maybe have the security. But what about the companies, or the small companies that are for 2, 3, 4 people, and doesn't have the knowledge about this economics, how to because some people live only with what it comes and it goes, and don't expect that one day would be closed, and people still have a contract, and people need still be paid and to survive. So as barista, I feel like I'm protected in this moment. Like if you maybe have savings as well personally, you say, okay, I'm safe for some time, but what it is comes longer. So yeah, I think it's the promotions currently, how to maybe baristas can help the owners to how to promoting to prepare coffee at home, to help to deliver if it's option to deliver. But the role of barista in this moment is totally stopped. So, and I feel really for all the baristas all around the world, because this is really complicated in the companies, the small companies that doesn't have a backup, or that can really sustain this program.
Thank you. Yeah, Michelle, just did you want to chime in on that? And then we'll probably have to wrap up because it's almost at the top of the hour.
I did. I just wanted to add one thing that I know that is going on here in New York with a lot of different restaurants for their staff, which are similar. You know, their serving staff, for example, are completely out of work, and I have a number of friends that are dealing with that scenario, and in smaller environments where they don't have these sort of safety net resources available to them. What's been starting to spread a little bit, though, is there is a sort of disconnect between people who have not who are going to suddenly find themselves in a place where they can't afford the basics at all, and haven't feel uncomfortable making asks for help, because that is a very different thing than they have done in the past, and don't really want to be there. And what has happened in a number of cases is their employer has stepped up so that they can anonymously talk about, we have workers that we need to help, and we did fundraisers for those people, and then distributing the funds that they're able to raise directly to those workers. And it basically has been giving cover to workers who need to be asking for help but feel uncomfortable putting themselves out there to say, I need money, I don't know what to do. And for those small employers that know they can't pay, they're really starting to do online fundraising for any kind of, they're going to charities, they're taking that responsibility on to say, how can I raise money in this environment? What kind of charity is available so that I can support the workers that I've been working with? And I think that there is an opportunity to do that, and really hope that stuff stands out.
Thank you.
Let's just come back on the point that Jessica made, or we don't have time for other questions, right?
No, but go ahead.
I would sort of the point that Jessica was making about empowering farmers to be able to understand what a decent and fair price is then for their products. I sort of turn that around to say, for those on the call who are directly involved in their supply chains and have links to the farmers, it's a great call to say, how are you empowering the farmers you're working with? How are you improving their ability to manage their farm as a little micro business that it is, in terms of understanding your costs a bit better, in terms of understanding that efficiency a bit better, in terms of being able to see other sources of income that might be a good opportunity for you. So all of that sort of economic financial literacy we know is something that's needed in a lot of origins that the specialty world works in. But of course, on top of that is then the ability of individual farmers to a degree, but also their representative organizations to actually have a voice and be empowered and be enabled to have that say in terms of, what do I think for me and my members is a decent price that would recompense for the work and will help us meet what the decent standard of living is in this origin. So it's kind of creating that enabling environment, as well as helping individual farmers, their families, and their representative organizations to take a seat at those discussions and be able to make informed decisions.
That's a great point, Christina. And I think this is a really excellent opportunity for us to point out, obviously there is a lot more to learn, there's a lot more to do, and part of the motivation for us wanting to have this topic at this particular time is that there is a virtual workshop happening on April 7th. And so we are trying to raise awareness about this. This is being produced by the Living Income Community of Practice. You can find information at these links. And again, these will be distributed as an email after the webinar, or you can always reach out to any of us. Preferably, you can just get in touch with me, and that's probably the easiest way to do it. And then before we get going, our next topic on our next sustainability learning session will be on the topic of value distribution. And I think this is very closely related, obviously, to living income, and really looking at our coffee system. It's clear that the barista and the farmer side are bearing a lot of risk, as this pandemic has shown in such acute view, that their survival is at risk with very little notice. And so I think that we wanted to share a little bit about the work of the price crisis response, but not only that. And so if you could just give us your thoughts on value distribution and where you are most interested and where you'd like to see us focus on the next time we come together, which will be April 9th. So we don't have a Tuesday webinar because we are making way for that Tuesday webinar being produced by the Living Income Community of Practice. All right, I can see the votes coming in. And in this case, you can actually vote for more than one. All right, we're up to about 60, 66%, 69, 72. Give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, so here are the results. Value creation, top vote getter. So that's great feedback, and we'll be sure to focus on that in the next session. We do have another Thursday session that will be taking place in a few hours, and so we'll put these votes together. But thank you for making your voices heard, and thank you for joining us again. And we'll see you on Tuesday if you join the Living Income webinar, and we'll see you next Thursday. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Bye.